I've covered the topic of using mainspring winders in the past, and regular viewers may have seen me using this tool to install a mainspring whilst I'm servicing movements on this channel. I personally find these winders to be an essential tool for the watch repairer and would encourage every learner watch repairer to consider purchasing a set. But the truth is, these sets are really expensive and there are very few choices when it comes to sourcing a used set. They do turn up from time to time, but unfortunately they can still be very expensive and perhaps beyond the budget of a hobbyist or learner just starting out. It's a problem. So without such a set as this, you're left with essentially two options in dealing with a mainspring when servicing a watch movement, but with the second option being considered quite bad practice, and so the only real solution is to replace the mainspring of each watch that you service with a new one. New mainsprings will mostly come pre-packaged and bound with a soft metal ring that allows you to press fit the new mainspring into the barrel without the need for special tools. And then there's the second option. Well, the second option would be to manually wind the mainspring into the barrel by hand. But there are a couple of reasons why this is considered bad practice, and before we continue, let's just address that, because I've seen some discussion to the contrary. Now, the absolute best practice when servicing a movement, when you know that it hasn't been serviced for many years, is to simply replace the spring with a new one, and this is especially true if it's a paid job for a client. You rarely see me doing this with watches on this channel as, well, for the most part they're my own watches, and I'm fortunate that I can replace them at any time should I need to. Well, it seems that Chinese manufacturing may well have come to the rescue in this regard, because we're now seeing several new options for purchasing mainspring winders, and I'm seeing them being sold all over the place, from places such as AliExpress to eBay and Amazon, and even professional horological suppliers such as Cousins UK. And the best thing is, they seem to be excellent value for money, especially when compared to the Swiss offerings. So there you go. We have another potential option, and I've purchased a set in order to see how they compare to the Swiss version. But back to the question of winding in mainsprings by hand. And there are two main reasons why I don't personally like to do this. The first and most important is that you have no way of knowing if the mainspring has been distorted or kinked once the mainspring has been successfully wound in. Now we shall come back to that and discuss my second reason first. Winding in by hand can introduce contaminants to the mainspring. It's quite difficult to wind a mainspring in whilst you're wearing gloves or finger cots. Now, the light rubber can get caught in the coils as you go along. This will increase the risk of you losing grip on the spring, and of course, it could fly across the room or get kinked. Now, as you can see here, I'm struggling to keep the rubber cots from snagging, and in fact, it's even caused a split in one of the cots. Now, winding a mainspring in by hand without gloves or cots, well, that should not even be an option, for the same reason that no watch part should be touched by bare fingers when you're performing a final assembly. But okay, let's just imagine that you have successfully wound the mainspring in by hand whilst wearing gloves or cots, and you're quite certain that you've not introduced any contaminants to the barrel. Now that brings us back to the first point, in that you have no way of knowing if the mainspring has been damaged, and may I just say that the risk of damage is really quite high. The mainspring you're seeing me wind in here is out of a pocket watch, and it's quite a strong one, and as you might expect, it can hold up to, well, at least a little bit of manual handling. Okay, so let's now take it out of the barrel and see what we find. And on first inspection, well, it looks kind of okay. But if we look carefully, you can see that the act of manually winding this mainspring into the barrel has caused some distortion. It's coiled upwards, and although technically this mainspring will work, it may cause extra wear inside the barrel. Now I suppose it is possible for the mainspring to become distorted in this manner from unwinding the mainspring from the barrel, but this is less likely as the mainspring is attempting to relax itself into the natural direction that it wants to go. Plus you do get to inspect the spring for damage once it's removed, and that is key. But when you're winding the spring by hand into a barrel, you are effectively using more force to encourage the spring inwards, and at the same time you're twisting it, and you do not really have any opportunity to inspect the mainspring for distortion or damage once it's fitted. But either way, if we do notice this kind of distortion, and if we are being purist, a mainspring in this state, whether from winding in or out, should now be considered damaged, and most certainly should be replaced, especially if it's a paid job. So that's it then. We have 4 choices. An expensive Swiss manufactured set of mainspring winders, purchasing a new mainspring for each watch that we work on, manually winding the mainspring in by hand, or purchasing a low-cost Chinese manufactured set. So let's take a look at these cheaper mainspring winders and see what you're getting for considerably less money than the Swiss offerings. And so the first thing I noticed is that there are several different options as provided by different suppliers, but looking closely at the pictures, they all seem to be comparable in design, and that suggests to me that the tools themselves are leaving the same factory and are maybe being packaged differently by the distributors, but this is just a guess. I also noticed that all the sets contained caliber-specific barrel drum and crank arbor sizes rather than the generic sizes in my Swiss set, although Bergeon, the company that manufactures my set, do make caliber-specific sizes also. The set I opted for contains 14 different sizes. Now I'll cover this in more detail shortly, but let's first take a look at what you get in the box. So as you can see, we have a nice stand to hold the individual sizes. And next, we have our crank arbors, and these are individually sized for different caliber watches. And here we see our first issue in that the handles have broken off 2 of these cranks. The rivets holding the handles to the cranks has failed. I also noticed here the first major difference between this and the Swiss set, and it's a biggie. I mean, potentially a very big problem which will almost render this set completely useless. Now, I'll explain and demonstrate this shortly, but first, let's continue to inspect all these barrels, and then we shall take a closer look and give them a proper test. So that's it. I found 2 damaged cranks. I suppose they could easily be fixed, but it is a little bit disappointing. However, we can see that we have 14 cranks and barrels in total, and indeed they seem to be caliber specific for movements including the Valjoux 7750 series, I assume the Rolex 2235, ETAs 2824s, 2750s, 2892s, 2836, Rolex 3135, I'm assuming Omega 8500, the Myota or Citizen 8200s, and I assume the Shanghai 7120. So let's take a look at the individual parts that make up each winder, and I will just choose one at random. They all work in the same manner. Now first we have the crank arbor. The mainspring is fitted to the arbor of this crank, and I'll demonstrate this shortly. Now next we have the barrel drum, which will act as a temporary container for the mainspring. And now we have the handle, which is basically an extension of the barrel drum to make it less fiddly to use. And finally, we have a stand, which provides no real operational advantage. And here we have side by side both regular cranks and a left-handed crank, and you will notice that the handles for both are the same. The slots cut out to accommodate the barrel drum both go in the same direction, regardless of left-hand or regular winding. And in fact, they're all designed for regular winding cranks, and so this may lead to instability when you operate one of the left-hand winding cranks. Now let me illustrate this by showing you the handles for both regular and left winding cranks as designed by Bergeon. You can notice that the slots are cut in opposite directions so that the barrel drum would technically become tighter or more stable as you operate the crank. Now this is not the case with the Chinese manufactured set, where all the handles are manufactured with the slots running in the same direction. So winding a left-hand crank will effectively be loosening the drum from the handle. But the barrel drums all seem to be okay. I cannot see any manufacturing flaws here, but I do find it interesting that each crank and barrel is provided with its own handle. Now, I will have to check in a moment to see if they're different, but I don't really see why they would need to be, and so it does seem to be a little bit wasteful. But I will measure them up shortly, and I'll let you know if I'm wrong. Now looking closely at the barrel drums, I notice that the barrel walls are made from brass, as are the Bergeon barrels, but they are considerably thinner at just 0.3 of a millimeter compared to the 0.5 of a millimeter thickness of the Bergeons. Now I also notice that the inner table and the pusher of the drum, or plunger, is made from softer brass rather than steel, as is the protruding arm which interfaces with the slot in the handle. Now it's made from brass and it's much bigger. Now I have been asked whether these barrels will fit the Bergeon made handles, and this does not seem to be the case. The protruding arm is too thick and the diameter of the lower portion of the drum is smaller. So bear in mind, they do technically operate in exactly the same way as the Swiss set, but the most common question I have seen regarding these is whether the barrels can be used or interchanged with the Swiss, or specifically the Bergeon Swiss set, so hopefully that answers the question. But the other question I see quite often regarding these Chinese winders is whether they can be used with left-hand wound mainsprings as well as regular wound. And the answer to that is, well, this set, as I've mentioned, is a caliber-specific set. And so some of them have hooks for left-hand wound mainsprings, such as the Citizen 8200 and the Shanghai 7120, but interestingly, and as I've already mentioned, the left-hand barrels do not come with a corresponding handle. All of them seem to be the same, unlike the generic Bergeon set, which comes with two handles to be used with left-hand cranks and regular cranks. Now, I just want to illustrate what I mean about the handles. So all these handles are identical, and furthermore, all of these stands are also identical to each other. Now, to me, it would have made far more sense to use only two handles, properly oriented for regular and left-handed windings, and leave out the stands altogether, as the base is perfectly adequate for holding them if they were drilled out to the correct size, or at least have only two of them, one for each handle, for example. And the cost of materials wasted in manufacturing the excess handles and the stands could have been spent on improving the more important materials used to construct the barrel drums and crank arbors. Yep, all identical. Breaking down the barrel drum, we can see that it's made up of several parts. The plunger and table are screwed together, and the screw was quite loose. Now it looks like the protruding arm is also screwed into the body. The steel protruding arm on the Bergeons are friction fitted in place. Now if this were made from steel rather than brass, I would actually like this better than the Bergeon design. This was also fairly easy to unscrew, and all these screw threads may well benefit from a small dose of Loctite. But now we have to cover the major flaw of this set, and it's one that can potentially cause this set to be a complete waste of money. And I'm sure many of you have already noticed this, and perhaps you're shouting at the screen right now. The biggest problem with these winders is the crank arbors, and importantly, the hooks milled into the arbors. They're made from brass. Now this is a massive issue because, well, I don't need to tell you that brass is softer than steel. And the mainsprings which are hooked onto these arbors, well, they're made from steel, and the action of winding the mainspring into the barrel drum will cause the sharp edge of the hole in the mainspring to exert pressure against the soft brass hook. Do I need to go on? I mean, what were they thinking? Even if manufacturing these crank arbors from steel doubles the price of this set, it would still have been a bargain as compared to the Swiss offerings. We'll test these properly in a moment just to see how the hooks will hold up. But let's continue and break down one of the crank arbors and see how they're made up. And, well, just like the Bergeons, the whole assembly seems to be held together with a brass washer and the arbor being riveted over this. Removing the brass washer reveals that they also used some glue to add extra security. And here is a shot of all the parts which make up the crank. You'll also notice that the cap is made from brass rather than steel. So here is the Bergeon set, and I'm going to install the pocket watch mainspring back into its barrel just to demonstrate how these winders work, and then we shall see how the Chinese set compares. This is a mainspring and barrel from a scrap watch, and I'm using this as a demonstration piece. Now, with a generic set such as this, we can start by choosing a barrel drum with a slightly smaller diameter than the mainspring barrel. And I can hook the mainspring onto the crank arbor, making sure that the mainspring is the correct way up. The barrel drum is fitted into the handle. And the crank is inserted into the barrel drum with the mainspring guided into the cutout of the drum wall. And then the crank is turned, causing the mainspring to be pulled into the drum. And near the end, I use a pair of brass tweezers to encourage the hook of the mainspring to go all the way in. Now, it helps if there's still some tension on the spring, so you may notice that I'm holding the crank and preventing it from spinning backwards. Now I allow any tension to be released, and I can pull back on the crank to release the hook from the mainspring, and at the same time carefully pulling the crank out whilst turning the crank backwards. The mainspring will want to pop out as you attempt to remove the crank, so care must be taken to ensure that this doesn't happen. Now I'm using my brass tweezers here to periodically push the mainspring back down the arbor as the arbor is being pulled away. Now it's tricky when you're not used to this procedure, but as with all things, practice is key. But with the crank fully removed, I can now transfer the mainspring into its barrel. Now to do this, I position the barrel drum over the mainspring barrel, and I attempt to line up the hook of the mainspring to be away from the corresponding hook on the barrel wall. Now this should not be a concern with mainsprings for automatic watches, but this is a manual wind watch. Now I press down on the plunger and the mainspring is effectively pushed down into the barrel. To be clear, the Chinese-made set is not intended to be for generic or universal use, like for example the Bergeon set that we have here. Let me take out this mainspring from its barrel, and in this case we're using a mainspring from an ETA 2824 movement, a size which is included in the Chinese set. I can confirm this by measuring the crank arbor and the inner diameter of the barrel drum and compare those measurements to the inner diameter of the mainspring barrel of the actual movement and the outer diameter of the barrel arbor. And they're close enough for me to say that this is usable with the ETA 2824 as advertised. And now choosing a comparatively dimensioned barrel drum from the Bergeon set, well, this will give me a crank arbor with a diameter too large for this particular mainspring to fit on. And in fact, using a crank from one of the other barrels may well work out, but it would not be stable as the barrel arbor will not fit into the hole of the correctly dimensioned barrel drum. And this is why for certain watch calibers it's better to use the barrel drum and crank arbor combination that's made specifically for that caliber. Now as you can see here, on a popular horological supplier's website, those individual barrels are not cheap, But if you do work with those calibers, such as, well, the Valjoux 7750, ETA 2892s, or the 2824s, for example, well, they may well be a worthwhile investment. And speaking of worthwhile investment, let's see how well the Chinese model works. And I'll place the spring into a brass arbor and make sure that the mainspring is interfaced with the hook and it's the correct way up. And just like with the Bergeon set, I place the crank into the barrel drum and locate the mainspring into the slot of the drum wall. And now, well, bearing in mind that the hook is made of brass, I'm turning the crank very carefully and very slowly, which is causing the mainspring to be pulled into the drum. At any moment, I'm actually expecting the hook to fail and the crank to turn without pulling on the mainspring. But I'm being quite gentle here, and we do manage to get all the way up to the bridle. Now, whilst keeping tension on the crank with my finger, I use some brass tweezers to carefully manipulate the bridle through the slot, and I can continue winding the spring, which now requires even more force to pull the bridle through. But luckily, the crank arbor hook did not fail, and I managed to successfully wind the spring all the way into the drum. Now I removed the crank in the same way that I removed the Bergeon crank earlier. And with the crank removed, I can see that the spring looks okay and it's seated correctly, waiting to be transferred into its barrel. And transferring the spring into its barrel is exactly the same procedure as with the Bergeon tool. Place the drum over the barrel, press down on the plunger, and the spring will be forced down into the barrel. Just a quick word regarding lubrication, as some people have asked why I don't always lubricate the barrel walls of each watch that I service. I mean, this here is just an example for demonstration, and so I've not really lubricated this, but if I was, then it's a barrel from an automatic movement, and this would need to have a special grease applied to the barrel wall to improve the performance of the watch. If this was a manual watch movement, such as with the pocket watch mainspring that I demonstrated earlier, lubricating the barrel wall would not technically harm the watch, but on the other hand, it would not provide any benefit or function to the watch either. So this is why you see some mainspring barrel walls lubricated and others left dry. Either way, the mainspring itself is usually very finely lubricated unless the manufacturer suggests otherwise. But after the first use, I'm interested to see how the brass hook held up, so let's take a closer look. And remarkably, the hook is actually still intact, Although if we do look closely, we can definitely see a little bit of swarf build-up. But I'm going to be honest here, I don't know if that swarf was there before I started. I didn't really think to look. Okay, up to now, this review may well have seemed a little bit negative, and well, I guess it's because I, like many of you, I'm pretty sure, will not appreciate the brass arbors. For some, if the hooks do fail, well, I guess they could be drilled out and repinned with steel if you have the inclination to do so, and that might make these winders great for occasional or hobbyist use. I mean, as long as you're okay with fixing them up when they inevitably break. And for others, well, they may consider repinning the brass arbors to be polishing a turd. As for me, I've decided that I'll not be using these, but remember, my Bergeon set is the generic one, and I've found it incredibly useful over the years, but I do not have the caliper-specific cranks and drums, and so I have two options. I could purchase them individually and use them with the handles in my existing set. That's quite expensive, but it is an option. Or I can attempt to make my own based off some of the dimensions as found with this Chinese set. I wonder which option would be more fun. Okay, before we wrap up this video, I'll just answer some of the questions that have already been asked regarding this set of Chinese mainspring winders. To be honest, I would rather look for a used second-hand set as made by Bergeon or K&D. They do pop up occasionally on eBay, but rarely will these sets cover all calibers. Just like many trades, once you go down the rabbit hole of purchasing tools, it seems to never end. I would say that one of the biggest issues with some of these sets that you find secondhand on eBay is that they will rarely, if ever, come with left-hand winders, as may be useful for certain Seikos, for example. But on the subject of left-hand winders, it may be possible to use a regular winder to wind these springs up using a regular mainspring winder set and a small hack. Now, if I get enough interest in the comments below, then I'll consider making a tutorial on this. Well, they are worth it if you're using them occasionally, and if you're willing to accept that the hooks will need to be repaired when they fail. But remember, this set is still quite limited. And yes, this is what I mean when I say the Chinese sets are limited. They are caliber specific and may not be useful for many watch calibers, as there are just too many. It goes back to what I said before, you never seem to have enough tools. There's always something else that's needed. But to be clear, for the most part, this set and similar ones to it only seem to be suited to very specific calibers. For example, they're totally useless for the pocket watch mainspring that I installed earlier. But well, what do you think about these mainspring winders? Have you purchased and used them already? What's your experience? Please let us know your thoughts in the comments below. But that's it for this video. If you like this content and you'd like to see more, then please hit the like button, share the video on social media if you can, and if you're not already a subscriber, then well, please click on the subscribe button below and click the bell and you'll be informed whenever I upload new content. And thanks to all my patrons who help to make these videos possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.